Cricutmas Day 10 has us looking at the engraving tip. Now, the engraving tip is a really fun thing that most people may not even think to use with their Cricut, but for me, it was one of the main reasons why I wanted the Cricut Maker. With that being said, the engraving tip is a tip that you add onto the quick swap drive housing, and it is only compatible with the Maker range. That would be the Cricut Maker or the Cricut Maker 3. In South Africa at the moment, you can buy the tip alone, just by itself, for around 450 Rand. And if you don't yet have the quick swap housing, then you will need to buy one of those as well, but you can buy the quick swap housing with the engraving tip at around 800-900 Rand or so. Now, I do feel that it's important to mention that you only really need one of the quick swap housings, because of course it's a quick swap housing, so you will quite literally just press the button at the top, have the tip pop out, and pop on the next tip that you're wanting to use. So it's really nice because it'll save you a lot of money in the long run, and you won't have to struggle with swapping things all the time. It's quite literally button, pop off, pop back on, and you're done. So if you are wanting to save a little bit of money, then that's the best way to do it. The engraving tip is made from premium carbide steel. So it is a really sharp and really durable tip. So it can engrave many different things. So it works with all your flat, softer metals and things like leather, acrylic, plastic, anodized aluminium, those kinds of things. The things that it's not intended to be used on are things like glass, as well as galvanized metals. So any kind of galvanized steel or anything like that, and glass, definitely stay away. Now, when you're going to be using the engraving tip in Cricut Design Space does have a setting for engraving. So just like when you would be working with the pen, you're going to need to change your line from cut to engrave. And just a tip here, if you are struggling to find the material in the send settings, then it's probably because you have something in Design Space that's not set to engrave, because it can't have the dual functionality on the mat at the same time. So you won't be able to cut something and engrave it on the same mat, as an example. When you're working with the engraving tip, you're going to need to make sure that you tape your material down. Now, most people tend to use like painter's tape and things like that, but I mean, I've used washi tape, and of course, because I'm using a very new strong grip mat, I didn't have a single problem. You also need to make sure the star wheels are pushed all the way to the side of the material, as same as with when you're using a knife blade, you need to make sure that the star wheels aren't going to be eating up the material that you're cutting. And of course, you can't cut wider than 11 inches. If you're engraving on a material that is actually quite heavy and it'll kind of pull the mat down a little bit, it is recommended to try and support your mat. So maybe take a couple of books and stack them up underneath your mat, just to make sure that your mat is actually perfectly level, as those kinds of things probably could make the material actually pop off or not engrave properly. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are working with your heavier in weight materials. It's also recommended to not move your fingers over the item that has just been engraved, because I mean, if you think about it, let's say you're engraving a metal, there are lots of very fine metal shavings, and those could potentially cause problems. So what I did, I took the tape that I used to tape down the acrylic blank that I was engraving, and I used that to pick up all of the little shavings that the engraving tip actually gave off, and it worked quite nicely. Now, some tips on using the engraving tip. The engraving tip works pretty much exactly like how the pen would work. So instead of cutting something out of a full color, you are only engraving the outline. So if you want something to be solid and colored in, you'll need to make sure that you're doing an internal offset to kind of counteract the fact that that inset is blank. So what I do in this case is I go to the offset feature in Design Space, and I move the little dot to the other side of the line so that it goes into the negative, so that it's no longer an external offset, but it's now rather an internal offset. I change that number quite low because obviously the actual engraving tip is super thin, so if you have it at like a 0.04, which is essentially the width of the pen, you know, it's gonna look a little bit funny. So I try and make mine maybe 0.01 or 0.015 or something like that, but a very small amount. What's nice about Design Space is it actually remembers that setting that you chose for the offset. So you can quite literally just go offset, apply, offset, apply, offset, apply, until whatever you're cut or whatever you're engraving has actually essentially been filled in. So that's what I did with this thing that I engraved, and you know, it's pretty much the same as what I do when I'm trying to color in something on the pens as well. I use the internal offset until I have everything exactly the way that I like it. I then obviously make sure that the sizing is correct, because whenever I'm doing something in a circle, I kind of guesstimate a little bit and then it's not the right size and then I've got to do it again. So, which is what I did here. This one was a little bit too big, so I actually had to start over and do it a little bit smaller. Story of my life. But but what you want to do here is you want to make sure that everything lines up. And the easiest way to do that is to center it in the middle of the mat, because the mat obviously has a little crosshair in the middle of the mat that is slightly thicker than the other lines on your mat. So you can relatively easily tell whether something is in the middle or if it's slightly off to the side. So when you're in the send panel, you make sure that you perfectly align, zoom right the way in by using the little zoom on the bottom left-hand corner, and place it in the middle. You can even use your ruler if you're, a little bit pedantic like me sometimes, and make sure that you're having everything exactly in the middle. And then obviously make sure that you're doing exactly the same thing on your mat when you're actually putting your acrylic blank onto the mat, as even a couple of millimeters out will potentially look a little bit funny if you have your design set up so that it engraves right towards the end of the blank. When you're loading your mat into the machine, now there is generally about a millimeter or so width, or a difference in the width. So you need to make sure that you're kind of either accounting for that in the software, so you're moving it a millimeter to the left or a millimeter to the right, or that you're actually positioning the mat smack bang in the middle, so you're leaving, half of a millimeter on the left hand side and half of a millimeter on the right hand side gap between the two rollers, or between the two mat guides, to make sure that that's perfectly in the middle. And then of course you get the advantage of watching it engrave, which is great. And if you've chosen something that's a relatively big design and you've done the internal offset, it may take a while, but luckily you can just let it go and walk off and do your own thing for it, and check on it periodically, because if you're anything like me, helicopter mom, so just, yeah, I like to always check on these things. What it will do is it'll lift up the blade every so often. So don't worry, that is perfectly normal. It'll lift it up and turn it around every so often to try and make sure that there's nothing stuck to the actual engraving tip itself. So of course, once you're done, you unload it, you take all of the tape off the item, and I generally recommend kind of rolling the mat over and pulling the blank off the mat. That will definitely help. And then you have your awesome little engraved blank, and it really looks super cool. You can use some acrylic paint to kind of color it in a little bit, or you can just leave it as is. I mean, I think it looks really pretty just exactly as it is. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this. It's something that I've been loving and, really having fun playing with. So I really hope that you get to enjoy it too. I hope to see you in my next video. And remember, be kind to someone today. See you soon.